Welcome everybody to, this is another Village Torah session as we are doing this on the Torah portion, but it's also a first for Village Torah because we have our Summer 2021 Rabbinic Summer Fellow with us. Here she is, Emily Dana, for the very first time, and we're trying out a new thing, a new experiment. We hope you like it. We hope we like it. And if not, we'll do something differently. But for this, I figured let's try something. Let's do an experiment and just pick out a few highlights from this week's Torah portion, chat about them, and who knows, maybe you're interested in some of them as well. So this week's Torah portion is Shelach. We are thick in the book of Numbers, which is, it's got a lot of dynamic stories going on. There's lots of drama going on. A lot of fascinating leadership insights to what's going on. And it kicks off with it's called Parsha of Shelach because that's the first it's a command that God commands of Shelach lecha anashim, that send forth folks, or really specifically men, and they're supposed to scout out the land. So, you know what, I've got a few highlights on my own, but I'm really curious, Emily, a few highlights for you. What stuck out for you? What were a few highlights?
So something I actually find really interesting is that second word, lecha, because God is telling Moses to send these spies out for himself, not for God. He could have said shlach li, which would be send for me, these scouts to the land of Israel, or Canaan at the time. But he has Moses do it, which brought up some interesting questions about free will and who has choice over what's going on in our story this week.
Very neat, very neat. Okay, so the sending out is not for God's sort of own sense of checking out the land. It's really for Moses and or the Jewish people writ large.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so that's one highlight for you is the whose benefit, who stands to benefit from this checking out the land. Okay, so that's one. What else?
This is kind of cheating, but I really enjoyed the Haftorah for this week's Parsha, which is from the book of Joshua, I think.
Yeah, book of Joshua.
Which is about the harlot Rahab that shelters some of the Israelite spies or Israelite soldiers when they are attempting to conquer the kingdom of Jericho. And the king of Jericho asks Rahab to bring those soldiers to him so that presumably he can kill them. And she refuses in order that she will be safe and they will be safe. And they make this kind of pact. And I think that's a really interesting part of our story this week. I also love talking about women.
By the way, that the Haftorah, there's a lot of Haftorah that are out there, and they're like prophetic, railings of one sort or another. Oh, this and that, especially in the summer, there's a whole slew of them.
A bunch of those.
But this one in particular, we could really focus, and that could be an entire series of discussions about just what we see in this week's Haftorah. It's a really fascinating story. There's a lot to unpack. So that's just a thread I'm just putting out there. Okay.
What are some of your other highlights, Rabbi Drew?
All right, are you done with yours?
I'm done with mine for right now.
You're done with yours, okay.
Come up with
all right, so here's the first one, which is the word tour. So the word tour, which I'm just going to literally translate as tour, like to tour out or to be a tourist. So this appears many times in this week's Torah portion, and I would actually argue it's sort of the most operational word. It's sort of like in German we would say a Leitwörter. It's sort of a very common word that finds itself strewn throughout this parasha. Now, it may sound kind of familiar to some of you as that it finds itself in the third paragraph of the Shema, which, ta-da, is the way that this week's Torah portion closes out. It finishes off with this third paragraph of the Shema. So this may sound familiar to you, of lo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei necham asher atem zonim achareihem, that you shouldn't go touring out, you shouldn't go seeking out after your eyes, your hearts, and that sort of thing. So that may sound familiar, but that's not the only time the word's used. So that is sort of in the last paragraph of this week's Torah portion, but as it turns out, it's also in the very first lines of this week's Torah portion. It's in the second line, it's in the second verse, but the first verse is really just God saying to Moses. So this is really in the first line of what God tells Moses, is to go tour out the land, go check out the land, select men, leaders to go tour out the land. And I counted it up. How often does it appear? It's 7 times in chapter 13, 5 times in chapter 14, and then we have this 1 time in chapter 15 in this paragraph of the Shema. So we have 12 times all talking about this touring of the land of Canaan, and then the 13th to tie it back at least verbally, from a language perspective, it ties it back. I want to touch on that, but really quickly, another way in which both this paragraph of the Shema ties back to this touring out the land is also the language of uritem, that you shall see it. So we have in verse 18 of chapter 13, urisem es haaretz, that you shall see. You should go see the land. And then we have in chapter 15, verse 39, urisem oso, talking about you shall see them. You shall see these tzitzit as a way of reminding you about not going, of not touring out. So this looking out, it's the exact same word, uritem, that you shall go see. It's you shall go check out the land. You shall do this. You shall go touring after it. And at the very end of the parasha, almost like a literary envelope that it closes it off the way it starts, is you shall not do this. Do not go looking out, and do not go touring after your heart and your eyes. So that's a very fascinating we don't see this word a lot, uritem. I did not check the concordance before we did this, but it does not occur a lot, certainly not within the 5 books of Moses. And I also did not check out a concordance for how often or how frequently this word tour comes up within the 5 books of Moses, but it's not that common. And then I have a bonanza. It's like an explosion of this word tour. Now, going back to this word tour, so I do like to think of it as touring, of really literally T-O-U-R, touring, and that these men that are supposed to be these leaders that are selected or commanded to be selected and then actually selected at the very beginning of chapter 13, that I like to call them tourists. They get to take a 40-day tour of the land. They come back with a huge bunch of grapes, probably more than a bunch. I mean, it's like a massive,
a lot of grapes.
It's like a massive, I don't know, it's an extra huge bunch of grapes. So they are tourists. They're, touring the land, and it's not just grapes. They also take like figs and dates. So, right, they take figs and dates. So they have a time, 40 days, touring the land, checking it out, bringing back produce. It's very exciting. And I think that's actually in direct contrast. The language used in the Haftorah in the book of Joshua is actually a different word.
What word is it?
Meraglim. So meraglim. So it's also a very different experience. So these 2 meraglim, which comes from the root of regel, of foot, because they're foot people, I guess. They're footing.
They're probably infantrymen. Maybe that.
Well, so they're not riding on chariots. They have no horses. There's no other things. They're just, as opposed to these tourists, for all we know, they might have not necessarily been on foot. They could have been riding in something because they had 40 days to go around, tour it out. Whereas these meraglim, they're there for like almost no time at all. And already when they talk to Rachav, this innkeeper, innkeeper is an incredibly delicate way to put it. It's really fascinating. Even her name means wide, which is a whole other conversation. So she's on the outskirts of the city, and even she knows that there's word out that these spies are around, that they're a threat, and that they themselves are threatened for this spying incursion into the land. And so the experience is so vastly different, and I think having the Haftorah juxtaposed this week's Torah portion points up how differently the experience was for these meraglim, who really were spies in the very literal sense of the term, versus these 12 tourists. They had 40 days, they were able to bring massive bunches of grapes around and other produce. So it's a very different experience, and I like to think of them as the dozen tourists. So as opposed to the 12 Angry Men movies, we have the 12 tourists, as it were. So it's a very different experience, and I think it all goes back to this word of touring. So just as they tour it out, they're commanded to, they do actually do it, and then there's a whole fallout afterwards because 10 of them are not a fan, or they have a dibat ra, they have a sort of an evil report. They're not happy with what they've seen, and they're actually they're fearful. They're scared of what this will be like, and ultimately they get killed by a plague. And then we just have two left, Yehoshua ben Nun, Joshua son of Nun, and Caleb ben Yefuna. We have Caleb son of Yefuna, who are the last ones left. They live to tell the tale. So,
and the Israelites get punished and have to wait
right,
to go into the land. Right,
so just as they had 40 days to go touring the land, then because of this one dibat ra, this bad report, to correspond to these 40 days, they have to go 40 years in the desert. So it's meant to correspond that way. So that's one highlight for me. That's a massive highlight. Second one is, these are going to be in descending order. So we do get to see the phrase milk and honey used.
Yes.
Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash, a land flowing of milk and honey. This is the only time in the book of Numbers this term appears, but it does appear 10 other times throughout the 5 books of Moses. It appears 4 times in Exodus, 1 time in Leviticus, and 5 times in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is the sole place that it appears. Perhaps a discussion for another time. What does this term even mean? Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash. And even the word Zavah, we also see it in Leviticus as flowing. It's just like flowing. It just sort of happens. It's just flowing. What is the milk? What is the dvash? So the challah, the milk is the milk, but it probably really means more of goat's milk rather than cow's milk.
Yeah, there's not so many cows in Israel at this time.
Right, because it's a sort of a rockier terrain, which suits goats better. And what even is this honey? So it's not really necessarily the honey of bees.
Probably date honey, right?
Right, dates or fig, according to Rashi. So they apparently it's just so I don't know. There's so much of it that it is just the juices of the figs or dates are just bursting, and the milk is just flowing out of the udders of the goats. So it's just a very plentiful land, both for the things that grow there and the things that eat off the land. So that's what it's meant to. It's meant to sort of put in our minds. But yeah, this is the only appearance in the entirety of the book of Numbers, but 10 other times throughout the 5 books of Moses. And the third one, definitely not something that anybody ever thinks about. I'm pretty sure that most people either flip right past it, or when they do hear it or read it, their eyes simply glaze over and they tune out, which is in the beginning of chapter 15, verses 1 through 16, is about nesachim, about libations. So not something anyone ever thinks about. We don't have a lot of mention of libations in the Torah, but what's fascinating about this section about libations, about wine libations, so we have later on in this book, in chapters 28 and 29, we have a whole bunch of libations for holidays, for set times we have libations. So that's very special, that's lovely. We also had, in chapter 6 in Numbers, we had the Nazir who offers a libation as part of his or her the sacrifice, the way to close out the time period of his or her Nazir time, Nazirite time. I guess I would translate it that way. And aside from that, it really only, I think, previously appeared as far as something to do in Leviticus chapter 23 with the Omer. So it really, but what's interesting about this one is when someone offers certain types of offerings. So this is not a set time, but different things. So for instance, there are 3 different measurements. Most people aren't really that interested in it because it's not something we do we haven't done in a couple of millennia really, but there's 3 sort of sizes. So if you're offering a smaller offering, and by the way, none of these libations are ever poured out with fowl, with poultry. It's only, so.
Is that an argument that fowl shouldn't be considered meat?
No, it's not. It is not. We have for a smaller sacrifice, a quarter of a hin. Not exactly sure exactly how large that is, maybe 3/4 of a liter, something like that. For a little bit of a larger animal, we have a third of a hin. And then for a much larger animal, we have a half hin. So there's supposed to be a lot of wine poured out. So this is wine poured out to God. Yeah. Basically, you know, wine, as much as humans love drinking it, why should humans get to have all the fun? The libations are also for God. You know, this is like divine drinking, as it were, these libations. So it's interesting that we get to see this of sort of a non-set time, because all the other times of libations that are supposed to be done, like I mentioned, for the Nazir in chapter 6 in Numbers, and then also all the different various holidays, and even in the daily offering in chapters 28 and 29 in the book of Numbers. And also, as I mentioned, one instance in chapter 23 in Leviticus for the Omer. But aside from that, this is what we see here in chapter 15, is when you make all these other offerings to also throw in some libation of wine. So those are 3 highlights for me to see in this Torah portion. There's still more. I mean, it's so funny. There's some Torah portions that really just are talking about measurements of various items that are supposed to go in, you know, someplace, or different garments.
Mishkan,
exactly, all of that material. But this, as we're in the book of Numbers, it's a pretty dynamic book, as we're seeing.
Quite a lot of stories.
Yeah, there's stories as well. Really fascinating. So I encourage you, Shelach. It's like I mentioned, you can check it out, chapters 13, 14, 15 in the book of Numbers. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Nope, I'm good.
All right, so this was our very first time doing something like this. Hopefully you like it, and we'll see. We'd love to hear your feedback. And also, this is Emily's first week.
It is, yes.
So, you know, if you haven't met her yet, I hope you feel free to say hello. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.